Good afternoon, everyone. Um, Today we are going to discuss the theoretical approaches to human rights, and we're going to see how different international relations theories have embedded human rights as part of their research. As a source, most of the information that is present in the current slideshow is taken from the Bailey Smith Owens Globalization for World Politics, page 508, 510. You can find all the information there, and of course, there will be a lot of information in part 2 of the same book, as well as internet can give you lots of academic sources on them. So we are going to start with liberalism, and we already discussed liberalism in Module D, and we emphasized in the idea that classic liberalism focuses on the individual rights, popular or democratic sovereignty, private property, and market economy. And if we would analyze the human rights from the perspective of this particular approach or this particular definition, then in this case, we could actually say that the classic liberalism is actually, or let's say human rights comes as a critique to the liberal assumptions, okay? Because, and in terms of that, classic liberalism emphasizes on property and markets. So if we would like to give a more extensive explanation of human rights from the liberal perspective, in this case we're going to mostly focus on the neoliberal assumptions which reflect the changing character of liberalism and which take into consideration the economic and social rights provided by the fact that the international community is creating market and state mechanisms which are working towards ensuring this right. So, for example, the World Bank is basically working with the let's say is working towards the improvement of the situation of poorer states, whereby, for example, the other UN agencies are working with the humanitarian concerns and so on. In most countries, liberals were the central figures which actually emphasized on the introduction of the human rights, of practice of human rights in national legislation. And this particular practices were later on included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we were talking about the international law before in our previous lessons, and we have actually discussed the way international law works like, right? Now, the Universal Declaration, we can consider it, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we can consider it as a model of politics, okay? Which basically is called the liberal democratic welfare state, right? So in this case, we would say that the human rights are embedded in this idea of the liberal democratic welfare state in terms of the fact that this state is based on individual rights, democratic accountability, mixed economy, provides a range of both civil, political rights, and economic and social rights. So while performing your research and using this information as part of your essays, at the end, if you're going to have to write an essay on this topic for your exams, you could actually use these assumptions, the liberal assumptions, to explain how exactly the international system nowadays is actually based on those liberal assumptions. Now, the next theory, which would include the human rights as part of their discourse, is realism. So we also discussed classic political realism in Module D, and we said that classic political realism emphasizes on national interests defined in terms of power, understood as the universal law of international politics. Then we said that neo-realism actually accepts partially the fact that there will be international institutions that will be, or let's say, will exist, but at the end of the day, national interest or national politics will be still at a very important level, right? So, what is national interest? Just to recap, the national interest is whatever the nation is interested in, and is not just reduced to the power alone. Some nations have dedicated part of their attention and part of their resources to the human rights of foreign nationals living abroad. And over the past 2 decades, human rights have become real national interest embedded in foreign policy of growing number of states, along with economic or alliance interests. From the realist perspective, human rights is nothing else rather than part of their foreign policy interests, right? So therefore, the advocacy or the human rights advocates, which should not be surprised when the human rights are subordinated to foreign policy interests, and they are actually part of the foreign policies, right? So basically, the decision makers working in foreign policy are going to try and embed the human rights as part of their national interests, so that they can use more coercion over the other states, right? On the other hand, once the state has included human rights among its foreign policy objectives, the participants in the decision making have to ensure the balance between the competing interests. So let's say if the interest is to have some economic gains, then and in the same time, this is kind of this kind of doesn't really come across or come together with the human rights interest, or let's say those policies that are developed to promote human rights. Then in this case, these states should be quite careful how they're going to ensure the balance between them. Now, another theory which would give an extensive explanation or let's say would help us to analyze the human rights is the social constructivism. So again, we discussed social constructivism and constructivism in general in our Module D, and we said that social constructivism looks into those constructions of ideas and norms, right, and identities, right? So in this case, we will find a lot of kind of similarities between well, it's not even where we will find similarities. We will basically find out that for social constructivism is not important why the states are doing certain actions, but how the states actually reach to this thing, or what stays behind the decisions, like for example what ideas or what are the norms that would stay behind the ideas. So in terms of social constructivism and human rights, we will for example take that idea of realism, of realist assumption about the human rights as part of the national interest. if realists will look into that into the idea that the human rights will be part of their foreign policy and therefore is going to be used as a tool to influence other states, the social constructivism will look into it as a component of social construction. Okay, and therefore the constructed nature of the international recognized human rights will take many forms, right? So it is always going to depend about the ideas and the identities that stay at the core of the concept of human rights, and basically the process is going to go from the implementation of human rights in first at the national level rather than it will come from the international level, because as we said, for example, if realism stays at the interstate level, then and liberalism somehow stays also between the local and interstate, or let's say level, then a domestic and interstate level, then we can say that constructivism is purely based on domestic level, right? So basically, from the constructivist perspective, whatever the processes are going on the domestic level, they're going to highly influence the way, for example, the foreign policy will look like. So in constructing human rights, international society has been significantly reshaped, whereby the sovereignty and human rights have come into completing each other, right? So if we would analyze sovereignty as part of the international practice, we can say that sovereignty of a state has been a constitutive characteristic of any state for the past 300 years. But the rights of the sovereigns and the actions of the sovereigns as part of a sovereign state actually changed a lot since the point, or since 1648, when sovereignty was included as a practice of the as an international practice, right? So for example, if we're talking about the beginning of 20th century, before the Second World War, state had a full rights in terms of decision and in terms of starting the war, whereby after the World War II, any aggressive interstate war has been outlawed. For example, and by the creation of the United Nations and all the institutions of international law, actually, the main point today for the states is to control the borders. Okay, so the sovereignty today, or sovereignty after the after the World War II, was centralized towards controlling the borders. Okay, so the states also have been prohibited from certain mistreatments of foreign nationals in their territory, whereby, for example, if someone committed a crime on a territory of another state, it would rather be difficult to put that person under trial according to the international law and according to those declarations in human rights, right? So the laws of war also have prohibited certain abuses of foreign nationals abroad. So it kind of becomes very difficult to regulate and to control where are, or let's say, to control certain behaviors. Certain behaviors of the individuals, right? So in these terms, we can say that the state, the international law, that we are talking about human rights as not just part of the international law, but as part of a supranational law, because now the state doesn't really have as much influence over what is going on in their territories, and they kind of allow the supranational institutions to interfere in their internal affairs. And if we're talking about the mid-20th century, international human rights have actually imposed more extensive restrictions in how states may treat their own nationals. So interaction between the states and individuals was reformulated with more political implications, so with the creation of more institutions. Okay. State sovereignty has significantly shaped international human rights, especially in terms of national implementation. So basically, we discussed before about the fact that a lot of, or let's say most of the declarations and treaties that were made toward, that would include the human rights principles, actually as a matter of, we were discussing about human rights as a matter of international, law, right? Now, we can also notice that certain processes of construction were built between the human rights and related concepts and practices. For example, if we're talking about the humanitarian actions, or if we're talking about the if we were talking about the genocide, for example, it is a concept or a principle that is enforced separate as a separate body of international law. So basically, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and International Human Rights Convention does not mention genocide. Okay, it is mentioned in a separate treaty. So basically, the genocide, war crimes, and human rights violations have been constructed as separate violations and have been constructed as separate institutions. It is also very important to recognize that human rights does not provide a comprehensive account of the justice and morality. For example, security and development, in terms of security and development, people who enjoy their human rights in more developed countries will be more secure because the institutions work better, and therefore their countries will be more developed than those who are in poor countries where they don't feel secure, where the institutions are not functioning well, where there are high levels or incidence of the of crimes and so on, right? So in terms of social constructivism, human rights are not just abstract values. These are social practices which are helping to realize those values, and human rights would entitle individuals for certain goods, services, opportunities, protections, but they also authorize right holders to claim them against society and state. So we can see that human rights are empowering some individuals to act. It's not just about the way the state wants to see human rights implemented, but it is how the civil society and individuals actually are replying to it, right? And how are they fighting back collectively on behalf of their rights. So human rights are considered as tools of as tools of active citizens rather than passive recipients of the beneficiaries of state and society. In the process of and while ensuring the process of enforcing the human rights in the normative structures, in the international norms, in international society, it actually contributes a lot to the development of a more equal society and a peaceful society. Now, the last but not the least, we're going to discuss about critical theories. We discussed them as separate theories in our Module D. So we refer to postmodernism, we referred to Marxism, and we referred to the post-colonialism, right? So in terms of critical theories in human rights, most of the critical theories will emphasize on the idea that Western hegemony of the Western hegemony, which is understood as a form of oppressive domination. Okay? And this oppressive domination is mainly embedded or mainly enforced through ideas and values that are backed by force. So basically, from the critical perspective, the Western world is actually using force anytime they want to enforce certain human rights. Okay, so in general terms, the human rights is that the critical story of human rights is that the Western states and elites would construct them to spread Western economic system, political power, and they basically were and the main goal of this system is actually to marginalize women, marginalize minorities, and that happened both at home and abroad. Okay, so basically the inequality, or let's say the human rights, is not actually oriented to towards a more equal world, but is more oriented towards an increased inequality. Okay. So if we're looking back into history, we can say that the Western states were indeed international promoters of human rights. So on the local level, but the spread of international human rights has to do more with voluntary demand, and from below, or let's say from a domestic level, and less it has to do actually from an coercion imposed from above, right? We cannot, well, let's say in our discourses, in our practices, we cannot say 100% that the human rights as a concept are created by the Western world in order to diminish the rights of the post-colonial states and so on. But we have to actually be sensitive to the idea that there is a certain bias, okay, and a Western bias, and we have to be careful while analyzing the actions of the Western countries in order to avoid previous experience of the Western imperialism. We also have to take into consideration that sometimes the human rights diplomacy promoted by the Western states comes along with cultural arrogance and ignorance, where basically by trying to implement a Western approach to human rights, Western states do not really take into consideration some local specific. So we can, and that is actually seen a lot through the actions taken by US. So for example, President Bill Clinton condemned Singapore for imprisonment of a young American who vandalized hundreds of dollars worth of property in Singapore, while in the same time he was defending not merely capital punishment of the juveniles and mentally disabled people in the US. So this was it about the international relations theories and human rights. You can find more information in part 2 of the Globalization for Polish book. You can find a lot of academic sources on the internet, except Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is not a source. And yeah, good luck.